Moderator for today's panel on industrial animal agriculture. We've got some really terrific speakers here. I'm going to start off by just framing the issues a little bit, and then I'm going to introduce our panel today. So, we have a broken food system, and I think it's becoming harder and harder to find anyone who disagrees with that statement. Maybe there are some people here, but we can talk about that afterwards. But anyway, when a lot of people think about how our food system is broken and how it affects us, they think about our diets and diet-related disease. And I think that's a legitimate concern. But what I think doesn't get a lot of attention are the practices that we put in place to actually raise our food, in particular food animal production. And that's really our focus today. The way we produce food animals, I would argue, and I think our panelists would agree, creates hazards that are primarily and disproportionately placed upon the shoulders of people who live in communities around the places where these animals are raised, and certainly the people who work in these operations. So we're going to go into much, much greater detail on that today. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce our panel today. You've already met me, but this is Maria Payan. I'm going to read her bio. So in addition to her consulting work with the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, Maria is the executive director and a founding member of Peach Bottom Concerned Citizens Group. She's worked for years to educate people about and advocate for socially responsible agriculture through forums, films, community events, and even after-school programs for children. And I've encountered Maria countless times in the field, and she's a really valuable ally, so I thank you for coming, Maria. At the end of the table is Kathy Phillips, who is the Assateague Coast Keeper. She has extensive experience in advocacy and coalition building, having served as the executive director of the Assateague Coastal Trust since 2007 and previously as the executive director of the Eastern Surfing Association for 15 years. She brought the issue of land and water conservation in the coastal Bays watershed to the forefront of the 2006 Worcester County election during her campaign for District 3 Commissioner. She has numerous accomplishments, and if I were to read all of them, I think we'd run out of time. So I'm going to say that Kathy is a really, really powerful force in the field, and we're lucky to have her here today. Michelle Merkel, who is sitting in the middle here, is the co-director of the Food and Water Justice program, which is the legal arm of Food and Water Watch. Food and Water Justice uses the court system to advocate for positive change and provides legal support for Food and Water Watch's mission to ensure that the food, water, and fish we consume is safe, accessible, and sustainably produced. Michelle also has a lengthy history of working on these issues. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go past it, but please take my word that Michelle is also a very powerful and valuable force in this field. And I was supposed to flip through the slides with their pictures, but I think you can see who everyone is. Okay, so let me tee up the issue a little bit for everyone. Sorry? Oh, okay. So this probably comes as no surprise to anyone in this room, but food animal production has really ramped up pretty dramatically over the past 50 years. And this is a figure of some USDA data showing meat production by different type of animal product over time. And you can see some pretty stunning increases over the last 50 years. What's particularly notable, especially given where we are today, is the green bar. I hope that appears to be green on the screen, that depicts the ramp up in chicken production, which is quite substantial, and it's probably, at least over the past 50 years, the fastest growing sector in the meat industry. What's also changed about the meat industry is how the production sites look. These are some USDA data that juxtapose the number of farms producing poultry over time, which is this red line that drops off pretty dramatically, against the number of broiler chickens per operation. So broiler chickens are chickens that are raised for meat production. And you can see that that number has, for the most part, ramped up quite substantially. And you may ask, why do we see this dip in the number of chickens in the last 10 years or so? And there are a lot of theories for why that may be, but one would be that some of these farms have divided ownership. So you may have a single site with multiple barns where poultry are housed, and the husband owns half and the wife owns half. And it goes from one farm to becoming 2 farms, and the number of birds per farm drop. That may be one reason why that is. It's not exactly clear. But anyway, the point is that we don't have a lot of farms, and we have a lot of animals per farm. This is a map that depicts production over time, geographically speaking. So these are data from USDA again. If you look at the first map, this is a map of poultry processing plants. And each dot on that map represents a location where at least 50,000 birds were processed in a single year. So that's 1949. By 2007, the industry had changed so dramatically that we had to change the way we count the industry, or change the metric we use to examine the industry. So what we have in 2007 is that each of these dots represents a location where at least 1 million broiler chickens is produced in a single year. And what you'll also notice about this is that the geography of the industry has shifted really substantially. So in 1949, things are pretty dispersed around the entire U.S., but in 2007, we have a shift towards the southeastern part of the United States that we kind of call the broiler belt. So the industry has changed again in a major way. I just showed this. We recently got some new data from USDA for 2012. We get data every 5 years on the locations of the industry. And what I'll point out here is that while the geography looks pretty close to 2007, we've changed the metric again. Now each dot is 2 million broiler chickens. So very, very geographically concentrated industry. What's also really important to pay attention to is the economic structure of the industry. This is something that we'll probably all make reference to at least at some point during our talks today, and that's that the poultry and swine industries are vertically integrated. And that means that there are these entities called integrators. And I think the easiest way to identify an integrator is think about the brands you see at the grocery store. Those are the integrators, the Purdue's, the Tyson's, the Pilgrim's Pride. They're the ones that actually own the animals. They make all the decisions about how the animals are raised, so they control the inputs, they decide what goes into the feed, and most importantly, they own the processing plants. So if you have a contract with an integrator, you have access to a processing plant. However, if you do not have a contract with an integrator, it's very, very challenging to have your chickens processed and bring the meat to market. So they really have a stranglehold on the industry by owning all these processing plants. On the other hand, we have an entity called the grower, and the grower is the site owner and operator. They do not own the chickens, and typically they're over a barrel in terms of their autonomy in the contract system. They live somewhat in fear and go from contract to contract. If you are not keeping your integrator happy, there's a pretty darn good chance that you may not have your contract renewed, and thus you may have a huge mortgage to pay off your chicken houses. So economically, things do not favor the growers. That's not to say that the growers all act one way or another, but they often are at a major disadvantage here. One other huge detail to keep in mind is that the growers own and are responsible for the animal waste. Currently, while there are efforts to change this, the integrators have no responsibility for managing the waste that comes out of these operations. And I'm going to talk about the waste a lot. So before I jump into the waste, though, I want to talk about what goes into animal feed, because this is what I work on quite a bit. This is something that I think a lot of us have heard a lot about, especially recently, is that we feed food animals antimicrobial drugs like antibiotics. And we're not talking about different special classes of drugs that are only used in animals. There are some of those, but we also feed these drugs to these animals drugs that we would rely on in clinical medicine to resolve infections that you might get. So there are many problems there, and we can come back to that and talk about it later. With poultry, we're not dealing with synthetic hormones, but certain other classes of animals like beef cattle are routinely fed synthetic hormones to enhance growth. Until recently, we fed chickens an arsenic-based drug called roxarsone, although thanks to the hard work of a lot of people, that practice has been banned, although we still feed arsenic-based drugs to turkeys, and Maryland has a small but growing turkey industry. I'm glad we're not close to the lunch hour, so we have time to process and digest these unpleasant images. But we routinely feed animals the byproducts of animal production, including animals that are considered downers. So if a chicken dies during the production process, it's taken out of the house, ground up, and put back into animal feed. We also, oops, I jumped ahead. We also routinely feed animals animal waste. So poultry waste is a very common feed additive for poultry production and also for cattle production as well. So they're really great at recycling the wastes. And lastly, there's some other industrial processes that can contribute materials for animal feed. One example is the brass making industry has a waste stream that includes a lot of minerals that if they were to stand alone might not be so bad for animal health, but the problem is that these waste streams also contain other contaminants like heavy metals that we would not down the road want to be exposed to because of concerns over health effects. So we are feeding animals lots of things, and understanding what goes into animal feed helps us understand what some of the hazards may be in animal waste. So let's talk about how much animal waste we're dealing with. Just to give you a sense, in the United States, each year, humans, or people, generate about 7 million dry tons of poop and municipal waste each year. And we apply a fair amount of that to land, about 4 dry tons. In comparison, animals generate a little under 300 million dry tons of waste per year, and we apply almost all of that to land. But there's a really key difference between human and animal waste, and that's that we treat human waste before we apply it to land. There's a lot of debate over how effective this treatment is for human waste, and we're not going to go into that debate today, but we typically don't treat animal waste. The best case scenario is that we take animal waste and we do something called composting them, which means we let them sit in big piles and hope that the heat that's generated by the decomposition of the manure kills pathogens. The problem is that composting is not always effective, and there's a good body of literature showing that sometimes some of the antibiotic-resistant pathogens that may reside in the waste are not killed by that composting process, and that's when it happens. A little fun fact for you to take home is that we generate about a dry ton of animal waste per U.S. citizen each year. Okay, lots and lots of waste. So what's in it? You know, we know what we feed the animals, so we can anticipate what's in it, and there's a lot of scientific research to back this up. The most troubling thing from my perspective, in an immediate public health sense, is bacteria. So there are a lot of pathogens that are able to cause human infections that are present in animal waste. And because we feed animals antibiotics on a routine basis, it's not uncommon to find bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. So what that means is that if you're exposed to those bacteria and you become infected, you go to the doctor, you'd like an antibiotic to treat your infection, there's a good chance that a number of those antibiotics may not work. So an infection that may not have been so serious and easily resolvable by a doctor now may become life-threatening and may become more expensive, may require surgery, and in some very severe cases may be fatal. So that is absolutely a concern. There are also other microorganisms like protozoa and viruses like hepatitis E virus, avian flu that may reside in animal waste, and when people come into contact with that waste, there's a risk they'll become infected as well. There's animal dander, which can elicit allergic responses in humans, pharmaceutical residues, heavy metals, hormones, and we're not only talking about the hormones that are deliberately administered, but all animals produce hormones, and those hormones, even natural ones, may reside in waste and may have ecological impacts or human health impacts. And lastly, the reason we apply this stuff to agricultural land is because animal waste is loaded with nutrients. But as you'll hear from some of our other panelists, that's not always a good thing when applied to agricultural land at rates that far exceed what the land can absorb. So what do we do with the waste? I told you before we apply a lot of it to agricultural land. The problem there is if we apply too much of it, heavy weather events can actually mobilize the contaminants that are in the waste and the nutrients that are in the waste, either horizontally in the form of runoff and vertically in the form of leaching. In some cases, not so much in poultry, we'll actually store the waste first in these lagoons, and I'm going to show you a picture of what happens with a lagoon gone foul in a moment. There is a huge effort right now that we'll hear a little bit more about soon to take poultry waste and burn it to generate energy in the state of Maryland. Currently, there's only one of these in operation, and that's in Minnesota, but we have fears that this is really being pushed hard for our own state. Something I worked a lot on is the pelletization of poultry waste. So with concerns over the nutrient loads in the state of Maryland, there have been efforts to find other things to do with waste. And so one thing that some of the Eastern Shore integrators have done is build a facility to pelletize the waste, and then they ship it by rail to more urban areas or to suburban areas, and they sell this stuff as a home fertilizer, an organic fertilizer no less, and we can talk about if that's really an accurate use of that term at some other time. And lastly, of course, my favorite is that we feed poultry waste back to animals. But these dealings with wastes or these management strategies create opportunities for environmental contamination and potentially human exposure. So we talked about land application of waste, but this is a picture of a manure lagoon, or a failed manure lagoon. You can see this little rectangular structure here at one point was a manure lagoon. This is after Hurricane Floyd in North Carolina, and the year is escaping me, but it was the late 1990s, early 2000s, where a huge storm ruptured numerous manure lagoons, and all the contents of those lagoons spread out into the surrounding environment. And so these heavy weather events are certainly adept at taking the contaminants that are present in these things and moving them around in a major way. There's also the concern about waste incineration, and one of my biggest concerns about waste incineration is that any heavy metals that may persist in waste are not going to be lost during the incineration process, and they either go out the stack of these incinerators and create exposures in surrounding communities, or they reside in the ash that's generated by these incineration processes, And that ash, as you might have guessed, is used as a fertilizer. So we're really cycling these pollutants, no matter how the waste is managed. Animal house ventilation is a source of air pollution into surrounding communities. There's a lot of ammonia generated in poultry houses and hydrogen sulfide generated in swine production sites that is generated by the decomposition of waste, and that can be blown out by fans into surrounding communities. And lastly, there are a number of operations that have been cited for direct illegal releases of waste into surface waters. So these operations really are effective at taking what's inside and sharing them with the surrounding environment. What's important also about the leaching I talked about before is that leaching can cause some of these contaminants and these nutrients to get into groundwater sources. And in rural America, almost everyone is on a private well that taps into a groundwater source. So if your groundwater source is close enough to where this waste is land applied and the geology is just right, you can actually be directly impacted. You can directly ingest some of these pollutants. So there's a really serious concern of where these things are sited. And let's talk about where these things are sited for a minute. Do you think these things are sited in Annapolis and Bethesda, where all the wealthy white people live? Not exactly. No, these things, there have been a fair number of studies that actually have examined where animal production sites are located. And so Jacoby Wilson, who you just heard from a moment ago, is one of the first people to actually publish on this matter. So he took some data looking at the locations of hog production sites, and he was able to juxtapose those locations against information about residential demographics, and found that these sites are typically located in places where the proportion of folks living there who are of color is much higher. So these things are sited disproportionately in communities of color. Another examination looked at the locations of these production sites, and this is looking at swine production sites near schools. So this is a figure from that one paper looking at the number of swine CAFOs. And CAFO, by the way, if I haven't mentioned it, stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation, or Large-Scale Animal Production Site. This figure shows across the 200 different schools that were looked at in this paper how many CAFOs were within 3 miles. And what they found when they started looking at the demographics of the different schools demonstrated, actually I'm going to jump ahead to this one, that schools that were of lower SES were more likely to be within a 3-mile radius of one or more of these operations. Schools that were low white and high SES were less likely, actually, but what was really interesting is that schools that were low white and low socioeconomic status were most likely to be within 3 miles of at least one of these operations. So what we found is that being poor and being non-white is a risk factor for being close to one of these operations. So the suggestion here is that race and poverty are predictors or risk factors for being closer to one of these sites. And what does it mean to be closer to one of these sites? And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go into great detail about this, but there is a fair amount of literature now that's emerging that shows that living close to one of these sites puts you at increased risk for an antibiotic-resistant infection or carrying an antibiotic-resistant bug. There have been a number of studies that have shown that respiratory outcomes are more common among people who go to school near where these are, and hospitalizations related to asthma are also increased. There's also literature looking at some of the things that I would argue that are health outcomes that are a little less classically recognized as health outcomes, and those would be compromised quality of life, depression, and stress. So if you live near an operation like this, it doesn't smell good and it's not pleasant to be outside. You can't have a family reunion, you can't have a picnic, you can't hang your laundry outside. And it's a little harder to quantify what that means in terms of health, but it really has an impact on communities, and we're struggling in public health to really quantify or try and figure out the economic value of that disadvantage. But that disadvantage is real and very meaningful for the people who live around it, and you'll hear more about that today. And there's a fair amount of literature documenting that if you have CAFO near where you live, your house is worth less money. So there are absolutely public health, social and economic woes associated with being near one of these things. So a couple of take-home points. Agriculture has changed a lot in the past 50 years to the point where a lot of people have trouble calling this type of food production agriculture. The consolidation and concentration of the industry has a lot to do with the generation of hazards, and really I hope I've communicated that to you today. the things we do, the inputs, the drugs, can really enhance these hazards, but those things alone are not responsible for the hazards. And so I think there's a lot of focus on, solving the antibiotics problem in animal agriculture. I will tell you right now, that's not going to fix our food system. That's not going to really remedy the worst of the ills that are faced by the people who live around these things. So keep that in mind. And lastly, the system disproportionately impacts people of color, the poor. And I didn't talk a lot about it today for the sake of time, but the workers are the ones who spend the most time in these things. And they're also heavily burdened as well. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our first speaker, Maria Payan. Maria, you want to come up and take things over?
Okay, I'm going to try to take the science that Keith was just describing with all of this and relate this to actually living in a community where there is industrial agriculture. I became involved in this when we had it come into our community. And no one can understand that rural communities and even most of our farmers do not consider this agriculture. It's a very dividing topic, and you'll find that people that are farmers are scared to talk about it because it's kind of like you don't want to speak out against your industry. They're scared of regulation. And then you have the other side of it, which is the community. And everything that Keith described is absolutely true. The quality of life is gone. You cannot go out anymore. And I'll give you a perfect example. In my community, the grandson of the largest farmer in York County is a friend of my son's. And they would come over and play football in the backyard. I live directly across the street from a cattle feedlot, which has underground manure storage, and you'll see pictures of that as we go along. 100,000 broiler chickens, and we have 2,450 hogs about a half mile up the street. He is not allowed to come over to my house because it's polluted over there. This is the grandson of the largest farm family in York County. I mean, think about that. And think about this as a small child, to have your friend say that they're not allowed to come over because it's polluted over here. This is what we're talking about. It gets real. It gets real in your life. So let me tell you a little bit about SRAP. SRAP, we're one of the very few organizations, I like to call us boots on the ground. We get calls from farmers at different rural communities. Matter of fact, we have Jay and his wife working with their community in Delaware. Now they're here for some community involvement tomorrow. But it's a very complex topic, and when it comes into your community, communities are in a situation where they feel that the agencies are out there taking care of this, and we have environmental protection agencies and different state agencies, and we have elected officials who are taking care of everything, and they have to go through this rigorous permitting process, and everything's going to be fine. And you find out when it comes in, democracy, it is shattered. It is shattered like you've never believed in your life. And you go to these people who are supposed to be protecting you and helping you, and you find out they're holding hands on the other side. So now you're in a position where it's a community with little political power, and who is going to help you? Who do you go to? So this is where SRAP comes in. And SRAP, we have a team that is a national nonprofit, and these people are committed. I mean, it's 24/7. You can call in the middle of the night. You can call and cry on our shoulder. We'll teach you how to do FOIAs. We'll teach you how to do file reviews. We'll help get technical comments for you. And it is a godsend to a community. I think Jay will attest for that tomorrow. It is a godsend because finally you feel like you have some type of at least control or knowledge over what's happening. So SRAP, we do a lot with the communities, and again, a lot of the people that call on us are farms. They're farmers themselves. They don't consider this type of farming. So this is a little bit what we just talked about. It's a David and Goliath battle for sure. The lobbyists, you have trade groups like Farm Bureau and some of these very strong political lobby groups who, let's face it, there's a lot of money changing hands and being donated, and this is what you're going against. You have right to farm laws, and that just amazes me because the farms that rural community wants to live near, these aren't farms, and you'll see when I get into the pictures. These are highly industrialized factories, and nobody should be living near them. Lax enforcement, we talked about the agencies, and you will see pictures, aerials, that it's not a problem once in a while, it's a problem and it's everywhere. And it's just as easy to go up in a plane and just spot them and pull them up, and you'll see some of that. We do that as well. Elected officials, often more like indentured servants, and that is the honest to God's truth. I have been to every, elected politician in my county, in my state, and they're not going to speak out because they may not get reelected. I don't know if you were, have been watching the news with the Chris Christie thing with the gestation crates. There you go. There's, I think, 14,000 pigs in New Jersey, and it's like 90-some% of New Jersey wants it. He vetoed it. Why? Because he wants to run for president possibly, and Iowa, they're not going to like that out there. So this is what you're dealing with. And I want to touch a little bit about the farmer. The contract farmer is not the enemy. We have built a system where they are not making a living wage to farm the land. It's get big, get out. The subsidies are put in place for the big, large farms, not for, the people who are really farming. So when they sign a contract, they're not being very honest with them. And I know many contract farmers, matter of fact, another one in the news this week, opened their houses up. A gentleman named Craig Watts, who has come out and done conferences to educate the public on what goes on. And he's worked to try to change the GIPSA rules and make fair practices for farms. He's been to Washington, worked for years. The night before the bill got stripped out. This is what happens. So he opened his house finally, and they're retaliating. So write that name down, Craig Watts. Take a look at what's going on in the news with this and watch, because they will retaliate now against him for opening the door so you can see. All right, so here we go. This is, I live directly across the street. See the very small house on the left? That's a colonial type farm, 4-bedroom house. I live right on the other side of that little street there. And look at that house in comparison to the size of, these are 4 broiler houses. 25,000 birds in each house. This is under the roof here. There's cattle to feedlot. They bring them in there and towards the end of, before they're going to be slaughtered, and they stand there and they eat and they poop, and they are not allowed out. They don't exercise to fatten them up before slaughter. There's liquid waste under there, and if you see here, this is from the air, there's a pipe in here where it gets stored for winter storage. This is waste that they bring in to make the silage to feed them. Here, this waste pond that holds just the winter manure storage, it's 10 feet deep, it's 100 feet wide, and it's 120 feet long. My house can fit inside of that. I can't sell my house. I've tried. I'm paying very high taxes. We no longer have a business there. My husband has had health problems, and you'll see more. This is what Kiev, we're bringing this and putting it in the community. Here we are. Okay, this is a picture of a swine farm, and you can see how, look at the condition of the animals. Is this what we want our food system to be? This is from my community. This is from the swine farm up the street. You can see the animals just laid out. This is not proper mortality disposal. It should be composted. It can be rendered, but to lay it out, we had 50 of them within 50 feet of a stream, which is right into the ground. This is a spreader spraying liquid pig manure. This was after one of our zoning hearings where the operator lost pretty badly. So to pay us back, they took liquid spray manure and in the middle of a blizzard, which they're not supposed to do in the winter, poured it all over our fields. So it runs into our wells. So they use it as a weapon. This is, again, across the street from me, the cattle feedlot. It's hard to see in this picture. It was liquid manure on both sides of the street for hundreds of feet. Cars were running in and it was liquid spraying off. This was before a rainstorm. I called up DEP. A fire chief came out and threw sand. This is after the cleanup, before the rainstorm. And I emailed him the next day and I said, do you know what happened to it? It ran all, off. Nobody did anything to clean it up. And I got an email back that said, actually the rain is better for the absorption rate. It'll actually help it to incorporate in the soil. And I wrote a nice email back and said, I didn't realize asphalt had an absorption rate, but thank you. This is what you deal with. You can't make it up. This is my friend's house who, she had a 21-acre farm right next to the pig facility. My friend now lives in Stewartstown and is getting a divorce. They had 2 contaminated wells. The swine barn was 250 feet from her house. Her daughter Mulaney had to be rushed from school. I think it was 4 times to the emergency room, 62 times to the nurse's office within a year. The gases that blow off that Keith was talking about, hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, her daughter Mulaney had neurological problems from the gases. Her son, little Christopher, would be eating breakfast and blood would start pouring out of his ears. Problems with the gases. She had a MRSA infection in her nose. 3 operations. It was eating away the bones in her nose. She had hepatitis C, which is something in the swine manure. Her husband was at the Virginia Hospital of Infectious Disease with $600 treatments of antibiotics going in. This is your rural communities near there. Again, this is across the street from me. This is a close-up from the air what we did. If you see that little house there, all those black specks, that's all the vultures. This is where they keep their waste, in an open, tight, and I was told that it shouldn't smell and it shouldn't attract any kind of vultures if they're composting it right. This is what I find on my yard. Dead birds. I find this too. Poultry, it's called Poultry Guard, big bags of it. Improving your poultry and your profits. So I looked online, and this is a lot of the problem. You guess, what is this? What are they doing? I'm on well water. This is put down in between flocks when they do the clean outs, and it's 100 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Now, look at the size of those houses. Each time they take a load of chickens out, instead of scraping it all out, the manure, they throw this on top of it to try to help keep the salmonella and the E. coli down. So if you figure 4 houses that size, figure 100 pounds per 1,000 square feet each time, that's what's going into our waterways. Here's the back of the bag. What's it say? Carcinogenic to humans. Really? This is my son. He just left because he hooked up with wrestling. This was Michael coming out of the bathtub. I had to rush him to a hospital 3 times. They had a 20,000 mortality at the poultry farm across the street. Did not tell anybody, but the neighbors knew it. If you can imagine what 20,000 birds smell like in the middle of summer, 4 months, we had flies in, literally, we had somebody on a fly swatter for months. And they're filthy. They carry this antibiotic resistance. They're filthy. This is, matter of fact, I was gone for a couple days. Last week, I came back, now we're into fall. I had to clean all my windowsills of dead flies off. In this temperature. Really? Okay, this is some things that we got in aerials that are not by me, but I just wanted to show you the widespread of, how it is not, regulations are not being followed. You can see the black area up there? That's spreading on top of snow. They're not supposed to do that. When it melts, it's going to go where? Right into the water. Okay, this is interesting. This is, look at the size of the tanker truck. This is a community on the Susquehanna River in Jersey Shore. They are bringing, it's a 2.5 million gallon concrete container that they built with not even a construction permit at the township level. The slaughterhouse paid for it to be put on a farm in the next county over and truck all this blood. This is blood from a slaughterhouse. You can see, look at the size of the tanker. Look at the wetlands. Can you see the wetlands there? Does that look like it's within 150 feet? Didn't even have a permit. Now, this plant is something called approved for immediate slaughter, and they're using the blood as nitrogen, as a nutrient for the fields there, and because it has a low nitrogen content, they have to use a lot of it. So 12 million gallons are being put on the banks of the Susquehanna River, and they have drain tiles that go directly into the river. Now, again, this is a plant that's approved for immediate slaughter, which means these animals can be diseased or sick. That's what they're spraying next to them on their houses. This, I got the pooling. See all the pooling here? When we took it up in the air to show that it's not being applied correctly. They're not allowed to leave pools like that in there. It's being just too much put on it, and that's what happens with the running. This is more pictures, same thing. This is more, again, of the truck. And you can see on the right side, where you see that sand, you can see it's leaking out the bottom. It's hard to see. But on the right side, so the tank's leaking. It's leaching right into the ground. This is their stream, filled with blood. They called me. I said, call the department, tell them come out with the water, get a water test. And I told her, call the lab, because guess who's not going to take a water test? The department. They were out there for 2 days, and they decided that this was the same color from doing a visual site inspection, the same color of a wetland, so it moved from there. I said, tell me, there has not been rain in 7 days, so how did that move from a half mile away to here? And he didn't have an answer. I have the lab results. Coliform's supposed to be 1, it's 1,200. See the Christmas wreath? That came from the same community. They're spraying the blood on top of the snow. I got an email. Merry Christmas from Nippenose Township. This is a community in York County. You see the pool around the manure piles. This was taken from a facility, and again, they say that they're managing these nutrients. We have these nutrient management plans. Well, this was taken out in dump trucks with masking tape over the lettering on the dump trucks to the next county over, put here, and it sat there for over a month. And that's all water that you see that's around there. Sent pictures, called the agency, no violation. You can see all the bones from the chickens in there. The chickens were removed 3 to 4 months early. These were layers, which meant could have been diseased. Good artwork, great for community organizing. This is part of Jay's community. They're fighting a slaughterhouse that they want to put on the Indian River, 12 million gallons, 2 million birds per year, and discharge on the Indian River, which is not even supposed to be done. They want to put it came out to be 414 factory farms within slightly over a 50-mile radius to supply the birds for that house. Every community, what are our chances of winning? Well, you see the foot on there. Good news, we've held them back for 18 months. They have not even gotten their local permits. We're fighting local level. We have some help from one of the universities, which is pro bono, fighting remediation appeals. So we've done very well. This was the governor's pet project, and they didn't even get the local zoning yet. They're not real happy with us, but, you know, it shouldn't be. So we had 3 victories alone just since July in PA, and all different scenarios. This one they were fighting for 18 months. And it was, you know, engineers and a lot of local zoning and going to the agencies. They left, the applicant withdrew. The one that was in Berks County. Adams County was a layer operation that they were applying for. Within a month. We got the community organized, did meetings, rallied. At the first zoning hearing, the applicant didn't show up, withdrew his application. So within a month. All different scenarios. You need to know where you press. You know, where are the weak spots? That's where you go. That's where experience gets you. The last one, love thy neighbor. Great story. I'll try to go real quick on this. One of the gentlemen who is a very sustainable farmer and does conferences with me, I got a call from a community. It was his nephew that wanted to put a factory farm in the community. I said, oh my God, you know, his uncle's a friend of mine, and this community wants to, I called him in with his uncle and the nephew, and I sat down, and I went through some of the stories, like the farmer I was talking about, Craig Watts, what really goes on in the contract, showed him documents that I had, you know, how they built things illegally. This is who you're going to be signing with. Is this who you want to partner with? And I said, look, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm doing a community meeting Wednesday. Come out, talk to the community. This is your chance to hear their concerns. And it was an Amish man, and he called me up 2 weeks later. He said, I want to have a meeting with the community. He withdrew. He said, the commandments and part of the things that we're told to do is love thy neighbor. And I don't think maybe buying the family farm is the most important thing in the world. Now we're trying to help him get a sustainable operation so he can buy the family farm. I get goosebumps when I talk about that because you don't see that attitude much. And that's Kathy Phillips. So anyway, we're plugging on, and we hope that communities keep pushing away, keep plugging, because I tell every community, we can give you all the resources in the world, you know, the engineer, but if you don't stand up and fight, you don't have any chance. But you can see this is just in July, since July, 3 wins. That's huge, huge. So thank you for letting me share a little bit of.
Hi, everybody. Whew, that's a tough one to follow. But let's see where we go from here. I'm your Assateague Coastkeeper. I am a member of Waterkeeper Alliance, and throughout the United States and internationally, we have clean water advocates who speak out for their waterways, and that is who a waterkeeper is. I'm a member of Waterkeepers Chesapeake. We are 18 programs within the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays. Hi, Dottie. Within the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays watersheds. And as I said, we are the voices for our waterway. And let's see if I can make this technology work. Maybe not. I need some help. I see. Okay, cool. And this is a little PSA that I'm going to run real quick that I think says it all about who waterkeepers are. Let's see if I can get this to run.
Waterkeepers, we're visionaries and activists creating practical, achievable ways to save our planet's sources of clean water. We're ordinary people, fathers, mothers, sisters, and brothers, against those who would pollute and destroy our precious, irreplaceable water resources. We are men and women drawn from different regions, races, and classes, bound together by an extraordinary passion and motivated by our shared and unshakable belief that clean water isn't the privilege of the few, but the basic human right of all. We know that apart, we are isolated and easy to ignore, but together, as waterkeepers, united in a common purpose, equipped with our combined resources of will, imagination, and determination, we are unstoppable.
Okay, and I'm back. As a waterkeeper, obviously I am concerned about my community and how pollution to our waterways can impact those who live in our communities. As you can see by this slide, pretty well explains how dirty water can impact us. Certainly for those of us who live on the eastern shore and the lower eastern shore, most of our water comes from well water. And so while our rivers and our bays don't necessarily provide our drinking water, it's what happens on the land does impact what happens to our drinking water. But it also impacts, healthy economies as a result of tourism, as a result of recreation, and certainly housing development, commercial development in within, close to waterways. People want to live close to the water. They like living close to the water, except that it's not very nice living close to the water when your waterways are covered with algae to the extent that you can't even get your boat up and down your canal without clogging up your motor. And where does all this algae come from? It comes from nutrients. Where I live on the lower eastern shore, it's very rural, very agriculture. The main economy down on the lower shore, aside from Ocean City, Maryland, which is a resort tourism economy, everything else is either forestry or agriculture. And as was explained earlier, Keith did a great job of showing, the amount of waste that is generated from the poultry industry on the lower eastern shore. And this is, I think, a great example of what is considered waste management on the eastern shore. This is a pile of chicken manure. Actually, that goes beyond being a pile. I call it my mountain of manure. This was actually up on this was up near Route 404 and Route 50 intersection about 4 years ago. I shot that. It just amazed me. I mean, I'm kind of known as the poop lady down on the lower eastern shore because I go around and I document where these piles of manure are, how close they are to creeks, to ditches, to waterways, how long they've been stored out in the fields like this where they're exposed to weather elements and rain. I think Maria had she had a better photo than I have of the leachate that accumulates underneath these piles. An interesting story about that is sometimes, well, this is from our landfill down in Worcester County, but the same thing happens, a lot of leachate, which is, of course, a lot of nasty chemicals and toxins that are in that. When the ponds build up around the Worcester County landfill, they actually pump that out with sewage trucks. They take it to Snow Hill, they open up a manhole cover, and they pump it down into the wastewater system, so it goes through the Snow Hill or Pocomoke wastewater treatment plants. And obviously, wastewater treatment plants don't handle the types of toxins that are in their waste management. I had this slide, which I love, to show you the amount of poultry manure that is generated in Maryland each year. If you can just imagine stacking M&T Stadium, on top of itself like this, and then filling it with chicken manure that exceeds my mountain. But this is what we are up against. Maria was kind of touching on it, as was Keith, that agriculture has this aura about it, and it is not regulated like other waste-producing industries, and it becomes a problem. The scale of the poultry industry on the lower eastern shore right now, well, actually on all of Delmarva, has greatly changed from what it was in the 1940s and the 1950s, even the 1960s. And we are no longer seeing small family farms with 2 or 3 chicken houses. We're seeing these massive industrial complexes being built. This is an example of one, and in fact, this picture doesn't even show you the entire complex. There are 8 more houses off in this direction. Up at the upper right-hand corner at that side, there are See, there's 6 there, so there's 12 more houses that go down the road there. This is all, this is owned by a different person, a different farmer, but everything else you see there is owned by one person. He doesn't live there. It's not his family farm. He doesn't live anywhere near there. And it's just managed by someone who lives in a trailer. Basically the same thing here too. And these are 660-foot long poultry houses. They can hold up to 30 to 40,000 chickens inside a house. You're going to have approximately 7 flocks cycle through. This one farm, well, I'm not even going to call it a farm, this one factory produces millions and millions of chickens a year, and produces all of the waste that comes from those chickens. And this is just one CAFO on the Lower Eastern Shore, just outside of Princess Anne. Do you see that little row of houses up there? There's 6 houses. So this is an interesting story of what can happen and how right-to-farm laws currently protect these factory facilities. All of this, there used to be about 6 smaller poultry houses down here on this particular poultry growing operation. Everything else was farm fields with corn, soybeans, horses, a little bit of cattle, the white picturesque farmhouse, the red barn. The owner of the properties over here to the right of those parcels, he used his right to sell off a certain number of lots for development. These people came in and built their small little rancher-style houses. They had beautiful views of farmland out behind their houses. What the realtor failed to tell them, which we now know the realtor knew quite well, was that all of that property had been sold to Mount Air and was going to be developed into poultry houses. So within 2 years of building their homes and being locked into mortgages for their homes, this is what they ended up being surrounded by. They can't sell their properties now. Who wants to buy them? I wish I had a close-up photo to show you of what these houses are like, but they're totally enclosed. The birds don't get fresh air. They're called tunnel houses because they suck the air in from one end and then push it out the other end. Because it's enclosed, because there are so many birds inside of there, and because all the manure stays in there throughout the entire flock, there's a lot of ammonia buildup. If it were left inside the houses, it would kill the birds. So that's not good for the birds. So where does it go? It goes out into the air where we get to breathe it. Another great example of waste management. So these houses are subjected to, the homes are subjected to the ammonia emissions, the feathers, the dust, the waste, the manure that gets sucked through those houses and pushed out into the air. And the people who live there, they can't hang their laundry up outside. One of those houses, they had attempted to have an above-ground pool to recreate in. Impossible, because it would end up with feathers and litter floating on top of it. And one gentleman who lived in that third house from the right, he was having very bad health issues, skin rashes, problems breathing. He and his wife tried to sell their house so that they could move. He had to get away from there. And they couldn't sell their house. And they eventually just walked away from it. And he let the mortgage foreclose. So, you can't continue to allow right-to-farm laws to protect what has become industry. And this is one of the things that we are trying to work on in Somerset County. But we're going about it a little bit differently. We're working with the local community in Somerset County to approach planning and zoning boards and talk about the health issues, the air emissions. and the problems of having communities so close to these factory-style facilities. And we are making some headway in Somerset County, which I'm really excited about. And the Planning Commission is going to take a look at their zoning laws. So we're going about it a little bit differently. You know, we're not trying to go after it from the pollution side of things, that, you know, the nearby waterways are being impacted by this. Instead, we're trying to make some forward steps by trying to change local zoning codes. We'll see what happens in Somerset County. It's the first time it's ever been tried in the state of Maryland, and might even be the first time in Maryland. And so we're real excited about this. I know Keith had this map up there earlier, but I love this. I had this on my Facebook page for a while. I said this is the U.S. This is the U.S. on chicken. And, you know, you can just see what Delmarva looks like. It's not even blue dots anymore. It's just a black mass. You know, the question is, how many more chickens can this little small peninsula hold? We have some geese going on over there. Just another quick slide, you know, to emphasize the density of poultry production on Maryland's Eastern Shore and over in the Shenandoah watershed also. This is, Shenandoah watershed is more turkeys, egg-laying operations. And I think we have geese flying through. Are they in the room? But from the waterkeeper's point of view, I have to talk a little bit about our waterways and how industrial agriculture on the Eastern Shore is impacting my waterways. We have a problem with phosphorus. Chicken manure is very high in nitrogen and phosphorus. A lot of corn and soybeans are grown on the Eastern Shore to feed the poultry industry, to feed the chickens. The nitrogen does get used by the corn and soybeans being grown. The phosphorus doesn't get used. Our fields on the lower Eastern Shore are so heavily saturated with phosphorus right now that any more chicken manure that goes on those fields, all of the phosphorus in that manure is going to be excess. It's either going to run down into our groundwater or it's going to run off into our streams. And that's another thing, streams. Everybody knows what a stream is. Well, I'm from the lower Eastern Shore. We don't have streams. We have ditches. We have agricultural ditches. The Clean Water Act defines certain types of discharges, point sources and non-point sources. Point sources are regulated. Those are end of pipe. Those are pipes that come out of wastewater treatment plants, that come out of car washes, that, you know, those are permitted and regulated, as my earlier slide showed you. Ditches are not considered point sources. They're considered non-point sources, but in reality, they are our pipes. This is up in the headwaters of the St. Martin River. You will see over there, there's like a little, I don't know if it's showing up blue to you, but it says Birch Branch. Birch Branch is probably at one time was a branch or a stream, but it has been channelized. It's just a big straight ditch. And it drains down to the bottom right-hand corner into Shingle Landing Prong, which then that Shingle Landing Prong is, comes off of the upper part of the St. Martin River. St. Martin River goes down into our coastal bays. So lots of times, you know, people will talk about impacts down in the coastal bays, like the Ocean Pines wastewater treatment plant, which discharges to the coastal bays. And stormwater that discharges straight out to the coastal bays. But you've got to go way upstream of the coastal bays. Those are great photo ops, but that is a pollution contributor, but it is minuscule compared to where our major nutrient pollution is coming from. And you can see the straight lines through all those fields. Those are all little ditches, swales that carry stormwater runoff from the fields. It's also meant to drain the land. We have a very high water table, obviously, that close to the ocean. And so in order to grow crops, you have to drain that water table down somewhat. So we just have this constant system of water being drained from thousands of acres, and for the most part, everything, all these ag fields that you see with their straight ditches, they eventually all connect to Birch Branch, and it all comes down into the coastal bays. I'm probably not going to see it, certainly not during my tenure as a coastkeeper, maybe not even in my lifetime, but someday I hope that these ditches are considered a point source and that they are regulated, and that we do a better job of handling a better job of waste management and handling the waste from our poultry industry on the Eastern Shore, so that it isn't just dumped on our land to run off into our waterways. I love this photo. This is someone who's land applying poultry manure to their field. The only problem is it was a really windy day, and I can't, the public can't see nutrient management plans for that farm. They're not publicly accessible, they're secret. I would love to see the nutrient management plan for that particular farm, because I would like to see how MDA can justify that the proper amount of nutrients are being applied to that field when the majority of what he is spraying out the back of this, what I consider an antique piece of technology, which is just manure spreader throwing dry litter out into the air. Some of it's going to land on that field, but most of it was just blowing across the roadway to the point where traffic had to stop. It was summertime, well, it was early spring, or late spring, but it was a warm day. Had to roll up your windows, turn your truck ventilation to, closed, and then make a run for it through there while all this stuff is hitting the side of, your truck and your car. That's all hitting the roadway, the ditches on the side of the roadway. When it rained 2 days later, none of those nutrients were doing any benefit to that farm field at all. It was all running down the ditch, which eventually connected to Nassawongo Creek and out into the Pocomoke River. So this is what we deal with on the Eastern Shore. I agree with Maria. Contract farmers, they're the ones who are left with the responsibility of what to do with this waste. They do see it as a benefit to them because it helps them to grow these crops. But the reality is that the waste management program for the lower Eastern Shore and for the poultry industry is broken, and we need to do something about it. And this is where I'm going to segue over to Michelle. And I don't have a pretty picture of Michelle. What I have is a waste energy plant to show you what we might be faced with pretty soon down on the lower shore. So some people, politicians, the farm industry, everybody who's trying to figure out what to do with all of this chicken manure as we keep growing more and more and more chickens on Delmarva, well, let's burn it. That way we don't have to put it on the land, it won't run off into the water anymore, but all you're doing is transferring that source of pollution to the air. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle at this point, but this is not a win-win situation to take your waste and burn it and transfer your pollutants up into the air. If anything, that's going to impact communities even harder than what is happening with land application. The fix is fewer chickens, and someday, hopefully, we will have a more diversified form of agriculture back on the Eastern Shore again, and we will have healthier waterways. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle. And I'm sorry, I do want everybody to read this real quick, though. I'm very inspired by Rabbi Cardin, and she spoke at the Environmental Summit in Annapolis 2 years ago. And she said this in her speech, and I wrote it down word for word. I checked it with her after the conference, and I use this all the time. And she is so absolutely right. And I had to put this in here because too often the industry likes to say it's an us against them kind of thing, and it's not. We're all in this together, and we're all impacted by it together. Thank you.
Thank you. We're a little behind schedule, and a lot of what I was going to cover actually has been covered already, so I'll try to keep it short because I really want to have time for a dialogue and for questions. But as many of the previous speakers have said, we have too much manure, too little land to spread it on. That's a nationwide problem here in the Chesapeake Bay and in Maryland specifically. How many people are from Maryland? Is this most of the room? Almost all of the room? Virginia, American Spike? Well, Maryland, we have, 296 broiler chickens producing over 550,000 tons of manure per year. We know that just from the 4 densest counties, we have an excess of 300,000 tons of waste being produced, and we know that number's low, but as Kathy mentioned, we have recent phosphorus tools that tell us that we've actually been overapplying even more than we thought we had been. And so really the solution is to diversify our agriculture system and reduce the number of chickens. But instead of doing that, the state's been in denial, and we're trying to deal with the symptom of too much waste instead of the problem of too many chickens, and that's getting complicated. One of the latest solutions, which we think is a false solution that's on the table, is under the rubric of manure to energy. And there's companies are incentivized to come up with manure to energy projects because a lot of the state's renewable portfolio standards have been bastardized by the industry, and so now manure is on par with solar and wind as a renewable energy source. And combustion technologies like poultry litter incineration is now on par with solar and wind. From my perspective, burning anything shouldn't be considered renewable energy. Certainly not in 2014, soon to be 2015, right? But that's a problem because with those incentives come a lot of taxpayer dollars. And without those taxpayer dollars, a lot of these solutions are not affordable. So Maryland's been targeted for the second ever manure incinerator. The only plant that exists, and Keith referenced this earlier, is in Benson, Minnesota. This is, it looks sort of clean, but it's the only picture I could find. But it burns 500,000 tons per year of turkey litter, and it combusts along with that turkey litter hundreds of thousands of woody biomass and animal byproducts. And we looked at this facility to try to see if it was a cautionary tale for us, and sure enough, we pulled the emissions inventories, and in addition now to all the CAFOs that are come in behind to support this plant, you're now going to have air emissions of very toxic chemicals coming to the communities as well, and the emissions inventory from this plant showed high levels of toxic chemicals well above what Maryland's current coal-fired power plants are admitting. So chemicals like volatile organic compounds and NOx, and we have particulate matter, and a lot of our greenhouse gas pollutants. And studies of folks living around incinerators who have similar emissions profiles have shown adverse health impacts, respiratory, reproductive, cancer. So we're concerned that, as Kathy said, you are now taking waste and putting it into one of these incinerators and creating a new airstream. And what happens with the waste that you're trying to get rid of in the first place? So a lot of the pollutants of concern we've heard about are nutrients, phosphorus, and nitrogen that are polluting our waterways. And none of the phosphorus combusts in these facilities. All of it ends up in the ash. Some of the nitrogen does, but a lot of it also ends up in the ash. Also concentrated all the pathogens and the metals and other chemicals and things that Keith talked about are now in this ash, and it has to be gotten rid of. And what do they want to do with it? They want to sell it as a fertilizer, which is our problem already. We have too many of these, this animal waste that we can't use as a fertilizer. Or they're really pushing hard on FDA to make it, to categorize it as a feed additive for animals. And so you're not really eliminating your environmental problem of concern. You're creating this new air waste stream, and you also may inspire increased consolidation into an area, because once you build the beast, you have to feed it. FiberWatt was originally the company that built this plant that was focused in Maryland. It's not just Maryland. They've tried to site in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in Delaware, in Mississippi, in Georgia, and Virginia. So this is something that's being considered by many other states, in part because, like Maryland, they have these renewable energy portfolios that incentivizes this kind of dirty energy source. And so in Maryland, it's been hard to find a lot of information about this. The state put out a bid because of the renewable energy portfolio standard requires the state to purchase 20% of its energy by 2020 from renewable sources. And so they entered into a contract with a company called Green Planet Power in 2013 to build one of these incinerators in Maryland. It was going to originally be a 24 megawatt plant. It's now down, they're talking about a 13.5 megawatt facility that would combust about 170,000 tons of litter per year and co-combust with woody biomass. The latest place they're targeting is Somerset County, as was mentioned before. They are a company that's gonna, this is a picture that Kathy was showing, they've never built one of these facilities before. They plan to have off-the-shelf technology, and the company keeps talking about this plant in the Netherlands that they want to buy the technology from. And so it's really sad for me because we have, you saw all these industrial complexes going up in these communities that have their own health impacts, and now we're going to put smokestacks up in the midst of all these facilities. And we have slaughterhouses, and Jay, raise your hand, Jay, because he's the slaughterhouse guy fighting a conversion of a pickle plant to a slaughterhouse. More than 400 facilities would come in behind it to support it. Somerset County, let's talk about that a little bit quickly. Somerset County is down here. It's one of the 4 densest poultry counties on the Eastern Shore, and not surprisingly, this plant is seeking to site in a community that's 53.3% African American. I've told that it's has the largest African American population in Maryland. That's not surprising. A lot of our incinerators and our other combustion sources site in poor communities and communities of color. So it's no exception here. We are working, ironically, Somerset County has also had an increase in consolidation of their CAFOs, and they've recently reached out to Maria at SRAP, to myself at Food and Water Watch, Kathy, in partnership with CLF as well. We are trying to provide them some relief, and so I just want to touch upon again a point that Maria and Kathy made, and that is, by the time these facilities go in, whether it's a CAFO or a slaughterhouse, a manure to energy plant, and you're dealing with the state or feds, it's really about permitting, and that's important because you want permits that are as stringent as possible and are going to be as protective as possible. But frankly, you want to stop these things from coming in the first place, and so we're trying to help communities self-determine and have a different vision for themselves, and it's difficult because these communities have little political power, as Maria mentioned. They don't have a lot of jobs. I mean, they're very vulnerable to these kinds of industries that'll come in and basically misrepresent the kind of economic growth that they're going to bring to these communities. And in fact, when they come in, they don't provide a lot of jobs. They destroy the tax base. They pollute the water and air. The property values decline significantly, as much as up to 80% if a CAFO moves in next to you. So it's a huge problem. But what you can do, and where there have been successes, as Maria spoke, is really work at the local level, and unfortunately your county commissioners and often your local leaders that make these decisions are also captured, but it is not impossible to win, and there have been many wins and SRAP in particular has been at the forefront of this movement. And so this is a picture of Somerset County. We got calls from folks that live around in Backbone Road area. You can see these complexes here, and they want to put 70 more houses within a 3-mile area. And so we met with 70.
Yeah, I know, but I know, but
no, 70 more.
In addition to what's already here.
Right, exactly. And Keith did an excellent job of talking about what that means in terms of public health. And they are concerned about public health in particular. And so we talked to them about what's been done in other states before that we could try here. And it depends on the state, but a lot of times your local health departments will have the ability to pass public health ordinances to try to address problems of density. In Maryland, they do not have that authority, but the zoning boards do have authority and, in fact, the obligation to protect public health when they're looking at their zoning ordinances. And they have to effectuate what's called comprehensive plan. So we looked at their comprehensive plan. We looked, which does reference the need to protect groundwater, drinking water sources, and other aspects that would relate to public health. And we looked at the law and determined that the right to farm laws don't prevent them from passing ordinances. And so the community decided to go to the county commissioners and make their case for updating the very extremely outdated ordinances and very few ordinances that actually apply to poultry operations and do not address the density issues that they're concerned about and do not address their public health concerns. And so we were told that we had to go to the Planning Commission first, and they are actually the commission that would draft the ordinances. And so Maria and Kathy and Shakobi, Frank Kim from CLF, and myself, we went down with a number of citizens and spoke before the Planning Commission about what their legal authority was and obligation was under the law. about what the public health impacts are from all of these CAFOs and from the, the consolidation. We talked about the Manure Energy Plant, which they didn't even know about. And apparently that's not that surprising that the economic development people kind of cut a deal behind the scenes, and then, suddenly it's before the planning commission and it's a done deal. So we broke that news down there. And it was, contentious. There was about 150 people, I think, total. A lot of the Ag Boys, I Love Maryland poultry stickers. They went after some of the speakers. Foolishly, they went after Maria in particular because that was a mistake on their part. It was like heartbreaking and also like very exciting because, don't cross Maria. She knows what she's talking about. So, I left there, sort of was unclear about sort of how much of an impact we made because they were, of course, very defensive. And you talk about the contractor growers. I sat in that room too, and I thought, even if you believed 5% of what Jacoby said and what Brent said, and you have kids, and you have a family, and you're living in this situation, you would be horrified. You'd either have to be in denial, or you'd be really defensive or panicked because you're trapped, right? A lot of these communities, once these facilities come in, like I said, their property values drop, and they're effectively trapped. Even if they want to move, they can't move. They can't afford to sell the house. That's, Maria's situation, right? She wouldn't be living in the middle of a hog and a poultry and a cattle facility if she had to, right? She would, you saw those pictures of Michael. It's heart-wrenching. And so they certainly are the victims and not the enemy, but, they're in the room. And so I wasn't sure about how it was going to go down. But excitingly, 2 nights ago on Thursday night, they voted to approve what we recommended, which is it was reasonable, right? Create the stakeholder group. We think your ordinances are not protective. Create a stakeholder group that has its local citizens, have the industry on it, right? Have the local health department. Let's review your ordinances. Let's update them. Let's make sure they're protective of the environment and public health. And they voted to approve it, which I was surprised by, frankly, but thrilled by. As Kathy said, this is the first time in Maryland that we're sort of on this path, and we know from other states, Missouri, for example, has 36 counties with public health ordinances. Their health departments have the authority that ours don't, but once a couple happen, then it gives political cover for other counties, and my understanding is the counties that do have those kinds of ordinances, there's no new CAFOs that have come into them, right? And it's a little bit of a whack-a-mole, right, because we're going to go to the next community and we have to be vigilant, but the point is communities can self-determine. They can protect themselves. They can prevent their communities from hopefully, up front before this gets to this, situation. But anyway, so I wanted to maybe end there to start taking questions, but hopefully just to let you know. What was that? Oh, yeah, Maria saying we were looking at their public health ordinances. You can cite one of these things within 300 feet of a home. But when you look at their own ordinances, a dog kennel, any kind of kennel is not allowed in a residential area. So you're not allowed to put some dogs and cats, but you can put 250,000 or more chickens within 300 feet of a home, right? And they were considering a wind farm, actually, that was interesting as well. The proposed ordinances, they didn't end up going through, but they had setbacks of 1,000 feet or more. And so, on its face, their ordinances don't make any sense whatsoever, and they happen to have already 63 million chickens in the county. They have very shallow groundwater. They already have groundwater contamination problems. A lot of their residents are on rural wells. So they really need to be looking at setbacks that protect human health, setbacks from manure application areas, setbacks from wells. I mean, there's a lot of things that they should be considering. And the other good news is that the local health department actually seems very supportive of us. So we're going to be working with them and hopefully helping them to be out front and trying to sort of, like I said, update these ordinances to be much more protective of the community. So does everyone, if you want everyone else to come up here?
I just wanted to point out the slide that I showed you of the massive CAFO.
Which one?
Yeah, that one. This is it right here. These are those little home sites. That's Backbone Road corridor up there with a couple of small residential neighborhoods, and then all that land in between those two horizontal lines, we're going to become another massive CAFO facility, and there's actually already one under construction right over here where it says Backbone Road. So you can see it's intensifying even as we're trying to make change.
Thank you so much to the three of you. We have about 7 minutes for questions. So I'll just say that I don't want to speak for everybody, but if we run out of time and you have questions, I'll be out in the hallway for a few minutes after if you want to chat. But we can go ahead and take 7 now. I hand in the back first.
I don't want to suggest that, sense that it is them against us, and we must do something ourselves to, when we elect our folks, to ensure that those folks are going to listen to us and not to them. And there could be a law passed in the state of Maryland, beginning this January maybe, that would say that industrial agriculture has to comply with the public interest and not the property rights, not the rights of the property holders engaged in industrial agriculture. And if they say, well, you're going to drive us out of the state, well, better them leave the state than that homeowner have to leave his home suffering because he could not sell. And let the rest of us remake these industrial agricultural sites and all the industrial sites to make a better economy for us all. It is them against us.
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah, I just have, so I'm a graduate student at GW. I'm getting a dual degree in environmental health, public health, as well as international affairs. And there's been a reference to terrorism and food security issues. And I'm wondering, has anyone taken that spin in this regard? Because if they're in these low-income communities, if they're maybe handicapping them by bringing in these industries in there, maybe offering them jobs or whatever, so people are not aware of what their rights are and what could possibly happen. How do you connect those dots? Maybe not terrorism per se, but somewhat in that arena where they're so there's low employment, and so they're needing these facilities to maybe employ them, and so they bring this into the neighborhood, but not knowing what's going to come on down the line. And the next question is, any connection to Superfund sites? There's tons and tons of pollution. So can we jump from the traditional Superfund sites from there to agriculture issues?
Yeah, I'll touch on that a little bit. The one thing I want to talk about, this what we were talking about, this proposed slaughterhouse, is there's a program that's called an EB5 program, if you write that down. And it's not only for agriculture, they're doing it with oil and gas, a lot of different industries. And what this is in a rural area, they look for out-of-country investors, usually Chinese, to invest $500,000 in a target area. They guarantee 10 U.S. jobs in 2 years. And what they do, they like to exploit these workers. They bring immigrant workers over and exploit them. They do not pay them a living wage. A lot of times they don't even let them go on bathroom breaks. It is very abusive, and people need to understand when they buy this kind of poultry and this is what they're supporting. The farmer, back to what the gentleman said, is a middleman here. You want economic development? Stop making the farmer to where he is not getting the full profit. Spread it out. Let each farmer make 100%, and they would survive and they would thrive. And we wouldn't have this mass pollution in one area. It would be spread out. That's your answer.
I want to grab another question. Maybe we can talk afterwards about biosecurity and food security. Sorry. Yes. Sorry.
So earlier this week I attended a conference that was in Howard County that was put on as a lead program put on by the Department of Agriculture for their up-and-coming young farmers to certify them. And so I went to a panel on it was supposed to be about how farmers are how technology is helping to save the day in agriculture. And so their panel was 2 crop farmers, someone from USDA, and a guy from John Deere. And so I went wondering, well, you're going to talk about how I wanted to hear how technology is solving these problems.
Right.
They didn't even address that. So so you have to acknowledge you have a problem before you can solve the problem. So if USDA and Department of Agriculture aren't acknowledging the problem, how can we possibly solve the problem? So
And I can tell you what I see down within my watershed is along the Eastern Shore. UMES has a number of programs that they're doing on campus to develop these new technologies, but they're all just pilot programs. They've gotten some grant money in order to try and develop application, piece of application technology that's different from the manure spreader, that targets where certain nutrients are needed, but it's all, they truck it out all the time at events like the one you went to say, see what we're doing. It's not even, it can't, farmers can't even afford that kind of technology. And the same thing out of Washington College in Chestertown, a number of different things that they're showing that they can do with switchgrass, that they can do with subsurface land application of manures. It's one or two machines that they truck out and show, but none of them are being used extensively. And it costs a lot of money to do that. And quite frankly, the industry isn't going to put any money into it, and the state is not willing to subsidize that to the extent that would get us away from the old manure spreaders.
Okay. Oh, I was going to say, we're getting signals that we need to end. So anyone who has questions out there, love to talk to you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
And thank you to our speakers.